Sewing a continuous placket. Continuous plackets are usually used at the top back of attached skirts or shirts sleeve. Let us see how a continuous placket is made. Objective: at the end of this class, you will be able to stitch a continuous placket. Let us first familiarize with the tools and materials that you would need to stitch a continuous placket. You would need cotton fabric, pattern square, tailor's chalk, pins, shears, a pair of small scissors, contrasting threads, hand sewing needle, iron box, measuring tape, seam ripper, and sewing machine. Now, let's watch how to stitch a continuous placket on a sample piece of fabric. Step 1. Measure, mark, and cut out the required sample fabric pieces. Measure and mark 8 inches by 6 inches squares on a single layer of cotton fabric with the help of a pattern square, measuring tape, and a tailor's chalk. This will be the outer piece. Use shears to cut the marked square. For the facing piece, draw a 12 inches by 2.5 inches square on a single layer of a different color fabric. Use shears to cut these squares. Please note, we are using a different color fabric for the facing piece for demonstration purposes only, otherwise we would use the same fabric as the outer piece. Step 2. Measure and mark the central line and the V-shaped seam line on its 2 sides. Measure and mark a 6 inches long line in the center on the wrong side of the outer square. Mark a seam line ¼ inch on both sides of the center line and join the 2 marks at the bottom center in a V shape. Step 3. Cut the central line and baste. Cut the center line open with the shears. Open the cut center line and place long side of the facing under. Secure the 2 pieces together with pins and baste next to the seam line. Remove pins. Step 4. Sew along the marked seam line. Start stitching with the reverse stitch to prevent the seam from opening. Then sew along the marked seam line. End with the reverse stitch. Step 5. Remove basting and iron the seam allowance. Remove the basting using seam ripper. Then open the outer fabric and the facing so that the right sides of the fabrics are no longer together. Iron the seam allowance towards the facing. Step 6. Fold the facing and stitch. Now fold the raw edge of the opposite side 1/2 inch to the inside of the facing. Turn the folded edge of the placket along the seam, covering the seam allowance. Hold it with pins and stitch close to the edge through 5 layers of fabric. Remove pins. Step 7. Fold the sample piece and stitch diagonal to the corner. Fold the sample piece in the center with the right side of the fabric inside. Stitch back and forth with a reverse stitch in a diagonal to the corner. When finished stitching, snip the threads with a pair of small scissors. With that, we come to the end of this class. Let's recall what we have learned. You learned how to stitch a continuous placket. Let's review its basic steps. Step 1. Measure, mark, and cut out the required sample fabric pieces. Step 2. Measure and mark the central line and the V-shaped seam line on its 2 sides. Step 3. Cut the central line and baste. Step 4. Sew along the marked seam line. Step 5. Remove basting and iron the seam allowance. Step 6. Fold the facing and stitch. Step 7. fold the sample piece and stitch diagonal to the corner. You have now learned how to stitch a continuous placket. Take our next class to learn how to stitch a simple placket.